Hola, buenas tardes a
Good evening and welcome to this Fundación Telefónica space. I'm Silvia Arroyo. I work on the programming team and the foundation. Thank you very much to all of you for coming here today to this encounter with Beth Noveck, talking about collective intelligence and democracy. This event is within the Eco-Society event Telefónica is organizing since March 2017. With this cycle, we try to analyze the changes that we are living in our environment thanks to the technological evolution. We've had 10 of these encounters already, and to sum up a little, I want to tell you, we've had Lee Haffrey this year to talk about the evolution and the relationship between culture and technology, Mr. Aquilas to talk about data protection and the internet and social media, Mr. Sanson talking about Leonardo da Vinci, not only as a paradigm of the Renaissance, but also as a paradigm of the humankind in the 21st century. And then we have talk about the dark side of algorithms and how we can use them in an ethical way. All these encounters are uploaded and on our website. You can have a look at them. For this event, we have a hashtag. You have it here on the screen, Tech Society. You can use it to share everything that's going on here on your social media. And if you're watching us on streaming, you can also use the hashtag to ask questions to our speaker. We will close with this one, but we are already preparing for 2019 edition. So pay attention to our newsletter, Aspen newsletter and Telefónica's newsletter, because you will have the next dates published very soon. I also want to thank the Aspen team. They've been working with us for quite a while already, to their directors, Santiago, Isabel, Gabriela, Nika, Monse, all the team. And I also want to thank David Blázquez. He's not in the Aspen team anymore, but he's been with us from the very beginning. And I give the floor to Santiago Liniers from Aspen Institute as well. Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm Santiago Liniers, Director of Programs in Aspen Institute, España. I want to thank Fundación Telefónica for the opportunity to organize this program with them. We think that it's closely related to the origins of our institute in the States. That's our goal. We want to make people meet and reflect upon what we can do technologically and ethically, both as a society and as individuals. To complement what Silvia said, we believe that it was important that we closed this program talking about the impact of technology on politics and on the way that we relate to our governments. We had already touched superficially this topic, but we didn't talked about it. We hadn't talked about it in detail. That's why we brought Beth Noveck here today to talk about open democracy and the MacArthur administration. She was the first director of technology and director of the initiative of open government of the Obama administration in the United States. She's been appointed as one of the most important, influential people in the world by different magazines and publications. Rocío Martínez Sampere will moderate the session. I really admire her. She's director of the Felipe González Foundation, and I hope that you will enjoy this session today and that we will see you again in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you to the Telefónica, and thank you to the Aspen Institute very, very much for having me today. I'm so delighted to be here, and I want to thank first the translators for making it possible for me to speak to you today in English. I'm learning Spanish, but I don't think you want me to practice it on you today. I do also want to mention at the start of what we're saying here that thank you for mentioning the GovLab, the organization that I lead at the New York University that focuses on the impact of technology on governance. I'm just coming from an event right now to announce the founding of GovLab Madrid. So we're very happy to have our European headquarters actually based here in Madrid. a place that has very much, as we'll talk about today, been a home for experiments, for advances in thinking about the use of collective intelligence for democracy, but also is a place in which that has been very willing to try things, but where I think we can all agree there is a lot more to be done. And whether it's here or it's in the United States, there is a great disjuncture right now between the ability of people to have an influence in and over the way that government works. So if you look at the most recent data in a report from the Congressional Management Foundation that actually goes to measure what is the way in which citizen organizations, advocacy groups actually try to influence the political process, most of them today are using things like mass emails. And they think this is a tremendously effective technique, 70%, and yet when you ask members of Congress how much influence does this have over the way that they think, they will tell you 3%. There is a huge disjuncture that we can see that when members of Congress tell us they want to hear more citizen town halls, and yet what advocacy groups are giving them, what citizen representatives are giving them are more emails, there's a real disjuncture in the way that we're thinking about using technology to actually influence government that shows there's just a tremendous gap and there's very much more that we can do, whether on this side of the pond or the other side. We have tremendous challenges that we're facing. For many of us, life expectancy is increasing, wealth is increasing, diseases are declining, but for too many people around the world, that progress is not evenly distributed. For many people in parts of the world, globally, in fact, life expectancy is actually decreasing. Diseases like tuberculosis that we thought we'd gotten rid of are actually increasing in many places. And other diseases such as diabetes and Alzheimer's are actually becoming, in fact, more prevalent in rich Western societies. We have a tremendous number of challenges that we actually have to confront, and yet we're not very good at confronting them. Government is not as effective as it needs to be. I work in government now at the state level, since I've gone back into government in order to remind myself how difficult it is. And it hasn't changed much since when I worked for Obama. When I came in 2009, this was my desktop. And I can tell you now, working in the state of New Jersey, this is still what the desktop looks like. Maybe we're one or two versions ahead, but it's not by much. We have tremendous challenges against which we're not making any progress. We are not making progress in the United States as elsewhere in thinking about how to deal with the hard issue of immigration. On climate change, the most important perhaps issue of our time, and yet our Congress cannot manage to enact a single piece of legislation despite knowing how difficult this is. So it's no wonder that people don't actually trust government to do things. We have tremendous challenges that we know of today and those that are still coming as new technologies begin to change everything about our society, including putting many people out of work and creating new jobs for other people. And yet we don't know how to manage these situations well. This is not a situation that's unique to the United States. It's a global phenomenon in which people all over the world don't trust government to be able to effectively manage these challenges. And it's a problem for us in the States, and it's a problem, obviously, for people in Spain who feel very much the same way. We don't trust government to be able to manage the challenges of our day. And what happens when we don't trust our democratic institutions? Well, what falls into the gap, what emerges in their place, is actually in many places the rise of significant demagogues, of people who want to turn us against our democratic institutions and to tell us we should instead believe in them and we should instead see them as the answer to our problems. And that explains in part the success of these populist leaders like Trump or Orban in Hungary or Morawiecki in Poland or Maduro, people who are using our lack of trust in government to create the opportunity for them as strong men to succeed. Now, these strong men aren't the kind that we've seen in a generation past. This is not about tanks in the street and shooting at citizens, but this is about, and I think we must take this very seriously, it is about a significant erosion of trust in our democratic institutions, very much to a dangerous level. There is a disturbing tolerance for violence that's emerging now in the United States. There is a disturbing tolerance for criticism of a free press. If you've seen the paper just today and yesterday, disturbing tolerance for criticism of an independent judiciary. A willingness to paint anyone who criticizes the government as somehow an enemy of the state. This is a very disturbing trend, and these things are emerging, sort of flow into one another. The emergence of populism, the lack of ability of government to solve problems effectively, the inability to legislate, it's painting for us a potentially very bleak picture. And you add into that, let me give us a few more negatives, and I promise what's coming is a happy ending, I hope, in this story. But we have a long history since Thatcher and since Reagan of actually trying to weaken the problem-solving and analytical capacity of government, of getting rid of and weakening institutions that know how to and want to use scientific expertise, that know how to work out difficult answers to problems. Why? Because if I spot a problem, then government has to fix it. And for people who don't believe in the project of government, who don't believe that government has a role to play in stewarding the public trust, finding problems, doing the analysis is a bad idea, because that would lead to us finding problems that we then have to solve. You add into that the fact that when it comes to training of people who work in government, we have over the last 100 years moved away from a world in which we trained people in the practical ways of solving problems toward a much more theoretical and academic way of doing things. The same trend we've seen in medicine and law and other places to make it more academic, more elite, more truly, quote, scientific, but as a result of which we do very, very little to actually train people in the practical solution to problems. And finally, one more challenge that I think we have to confront, which is that into this gap are coming plenty of companies who make the technologies we hold in our pocket that we use every day, who would tell us that they have better answers, that they have the solutions that would actually be the things that we need to solve our societal problems. But I think we have to be sorely concerned about a world in which Apple and Google and Amazon and Silicon Valley and their equivalents around the world become those who are responsible for the public trust. So I'm here today to talk about the possibilities that we have for rethinking what democracy means, for really changing and reinventing and reimagining our democratic future, not by simply giving up and ceding it to private companies to do instead for us, but to really take the question by the horns, and that's what I hope we're here to discuss, are the ways in which we can do better than think about democracy as merely the process of voting once a year. That's typically how we've thought about it. We've said that the basis for democracy is to vote, and perhaps we've given people the opportunity to vote more often than just once a year. But I think we can all agree, and this is not a political, I should be careful, this is not a political statement, it's just a contemporary political analogy, is to say that the voting once a year, the idea of a referendum, such as Brexit, or such as the ones we run in California all the time, that such simplistic models of engagement are not what we need, are not enough to be able to solve the hard problems that we face. We know that we actually have to be able to do a better job than either, on the one hand, technocracy and pure expertise that may be effective at times in solving problems but not very legitimate, or on the other hand, purely direct democratic mechanisms like the referendum, which may be more legitimate in some respects, but not really very effective at helping us to do the hard job of reducing traffic, of fighting climate change, of improving our air quality or our water quality, or improving our health and well-being. There's a lot more that we need to do and that we can do to take advantage of the technologies that we have that can allow us to govern better and differently. So you've heard previously from Kathy O'Neill talking about big data. She told you about the dark side of big data. There is a happy story to the ways in which data is being used for social good. But I'm here today to talk about another technology. Everything comes down to data in some sense, but this is the data that comes from us. This is the data that reflects our wisdom, our knowledge, our know-how, that which we might call collective intelligence. So I am, like many people, learning. I have a tutor for Spanish, but when I'm not using my tutor, I use Duolingo, as maybe some other people do. How many people use Duolingo? A few hands going up. Oh, a few people. And it's like going to the gym. We all start using it and then we stop using it is the only problem. But Duolingo is a great example of what we might think of as collective intelligence. Why? Duolingo is a product that teaches more foreign languages to more people than the entire U.S. school system combined. And it works better because the system learns from our intelligence. Based on how you or I answer questions, the software learns how to teach us. Should I teach you verbs first, or should I teach you adjectives first? And by doing so, improves the system for everybody. It's using technology to combine our collective wisdom in the way that Wikipedia does, in the way that classically you may know that the Oxford English Dictionary, that classic work, the original English dictionary, was actually developed not using any technology, but using thousands of volunteers who wrote down words on small slips of paper and then sent them in to the editors to thereby create the dictionary. This basic idea that we can actually become smarter working together than we can do by ourselves. So I want us to imagine a future for a moment, and that's the idea that I want to put to you today, that we can govern better and differently if we know how to take advantage of the collective intelligence of all of us to solve problems more effectively. If we can actually think about how do we connect those who govern to the smart people who are in our communities. So whether it's a person who has credentialed expertise because they've studied engineering or architecture, or whether it's simply somebody who knows a lot about a community or a disease because they live with that condition every day, we have the opportunity, I think, to think about how to use these technologies to actually connect government to citizens to be able to solve problems more effectively. And I would put to you today, or the core argument of the talk, if you will, is that we have to therefore think about how do we transform the way that we govern to make it a more systematic conversation between government and governed, between public institutions and the public, in order that we can actually leverage what each of us know and can do in order to solve problems. Now, this is not an easy idea in practice, and I often like to use the example of having tried to do this when I first worked on actually right after President Obama was elected. So I worked on the campaign for a long time, and then when President Obama was elected, I was the person who said we should ask citizens what should be our policy for the first 100 days of the administration. Typically, you have a period between the election and the inauguration in which you design what will be the first 100 days of that's the 100 days in which people still like you. After 100 days, they all hate you and they criticize you, but you have 100 good days, the honeymoon, in which you can actually get something done. So we asked people, what should be our policies? And you know what? They told us. It will not surprise you to hear that we got something on the order of 85,000 suggestions from people. And you know what we did with those suggestions? Absolutely nothing. We did nothing with them because we were not prepared to use them. Nobody expected that people would contribute. They didn't expect for them to contribute helpfully. And we weren't set up with the mechanisms to be able to take that kind of expertise on board. So fast forward, and we now have 1,500 communities, including Madrid, to the tune of 100 million euros, asking citizens, at least in a small way, to participate in developing proposals for how to spend money in their own communities. And just 2 weeks ago, we had an election in New York, and the public passed a referendum to institutionalize participatory budgeting, which has been a much smaller phenomenon in New York, to put that into law and to make it the practice also in New York City. There are 1,500 places that have begun the practice at the smallest level to actually let people decide where to put a playground or where to put a football pitch. But that's only the beginning. What we're beginning to see around the world is experiments, including here, but in many places, with institutionalizing the use of technology to engage with citizens around solving hard problems in a formal legal and policy-making process. I like to call this crowd law, not because all of it is crowdsourcing, but because it gives us the flavor of what it would mean if we would actually transform our legislative institutions, our parliaments, our congresses, our city councils, to actually begin to use technology to tap into what people know. This is not a new or theoretical idea. In Brazil, they have 650,000 people now signed up for an app called Mudamos, which allows people to propose things to their legislature. Around the world, just in the last 2 or 3 years, we have 100 examples. This is the map that we've put up online at a place called, at the address catalog.crowd.law. Catalog.crowd.law. 100 examples of the ways in which, again, legislatures are beginning to tap into what people know. And what makes the best ones most successful, and a big departure from what we've seen before, is that they are being designed to solve a particular problem at a particular time. That is to say, for every kind of decision, whether you're in a company or in government or in any kind of organization, whether you're making a law or a policy or a regulation, there's a cycle, there's a process. There's a process that begins simply with understanding what's the problem I'm trying to solve, that goes then to developing solutions to that problem, then to turning that into something I write down, some kind of policy or law or whatnot. I then have to implement it, and then if I do it right, I actually have to evaluate what works. And where we truly tend to make the mistake is thinking of citizen engagement and the use of collective intelligence as a one-size-fits-all process. And that does not work. It does not work to create a one website that will solve all of these different informational challenges. Because when what I'm trying to do is understand what the problem is, I need a different kind of information from people than when I'm actually looking for solutions. So in Taiwan, they have set up a process called the V-Taiwan process, which actually is a series of different platforms that they've put together. This is a diagram of how it works, and you'll see it's fairly complex, but in which they're engaging 200,000 citizens in developing, over the last 2 years, 26 new pieces of legislation. Hard stuff, like how do we regulate Uber, or how do we regulate telemedicine? They're dealing with hard problems and engaging people first in the process of identifying what actually is the issue and how can I actually use data, use engagement with people to better understand what is the problem that I'm trying to solve before I ever get to the topic of how do I solve it. There's an interesting experiment going on here in Europe, funded by the European Commission, something we're trying to learn from now in New York, to say, you know what, to understand what the problems are, maybe we not only have to ask people, but maybe we also have to listen to people. By listening to what they're saying on Twitter, on social media, through the complaint hotlines and phone numbers where they're calling to say, there's noise in my backyard, there's pollution here, there's traffic there. People complain all the time. They just don't have a way to do it to government. But they do it on social media, and what this project does, the Erasmus Dashboard, is about experimenting with using this concept of digital listening or sentiment analysis to try to understand where are the problems in order that we might let that drive our legislative agenda and let it truly be driven by what citizens care about and feel and what concerns them. It's a different process, though, than actually getting solutions to problems. So in Iceland, the Active Citizens Foundation has developed a website called Better Reykjavik, which engages 20% of the population of the city. Now, Reykjavik's a small place, but people are actively participating in actually developing solutions to problems that they're pinpointing. And they've copied this in dozens of countries around the world, including in Estonia, where what they did was they took the online process from Iceland and they married it to a face-to-face process. Why? Because the online process got who participating? Who participates in these online processes? Nerdy people, geeky people, techie people, male people. 74% of the people participating were men, when only half the population is men. So they said, you know what we need to do? It's not legitimate. It might be, we might get a lot of good ideas, but it's not legitimate simply to do participation in that way. We will also choose a random sample of citizens that represent and reflect our society, and we'll invite them to come and then develop the issues that have been identified. So they develop their whole legislative package around political reform, first by getting ideas online, and then deepening those proposals with people offline. There have been experiments also in getting people actually to engage in drafting the law. They've done it in Brazil, they're doing it in France, where they've said, we're going to get people not simply to come up with ideas, but to actually help us to write it down. Now, why would you do that? Legislative lawmaking, policymaking is hard and complicated. That's precisely the reason, to give people the opportunity to learn about how difficult it is and what the trade-offs are. We then have to implement the policies. And in Denmark, for the last 16 years, MindLab has helped to teach other government agencies how to learn to do that with the benefit of citizens, by listening to citizens, by asking them, by observing them, and then developing services for citizens that actually meet their needs. Now, MindLab has been, in some ways, a success and a failure. They've been so successful at teaching everybody else to do it that they've gone out of business. They were disbanded this year. That's partly a happy story. There's partly a negative story in that, which is that they did a lot of asking citizens, but they failed to use data in the process. So the new Danish government decided that we actually need to retool how we do this, and to not only ask people, but to use data in that process as well to get smarter about how we do things. And finally, the last stage of law or policy making that always gets neglected is the process of evaluation. We tend to pass laws, and then we never look back. Did it work? Was it effective? We wait 3 years, and then a think tank or a university like mine will write a report and evaluate a process, and by that time it's become so politically accepted that it's impossible to get rid of the program. So we have programs in the United States around poverty or education that we've been doing for 30 years, even though they don't work at all. So the idea that we could actually, as they're doing in Ghana, using the TransGov platform, asking citizens what's actually working, or as they're doing in Chile, this is offline, but they're moving it online, this concept of evaluación de la ley, where they bring together citizens in a focus group to say, is the law actually working? As they did in Brazil when they passed a law to say every child deserves a healthy, free school lunch. And then you know what they did? They asked children. They have cameras, they have phones, and they said, take a picture of your lunch and send it back to us so that we can actually understand what's working. Okay, let me conclude with, obviously there are a lot of challenges. And you're going to ask me in a minute about Cambridge Analytica, so I'll save that for the Q&A, because I find there's, I can't go 10 minutes before somebody asks me about Cambridge Analytica, so I hope you do. There are the challenges that we don't know how to do it. When it comes to parliaments, according to the World E-Parliamentary Report, 52% say they would like more support, learning how to engage with citizens, and yet only 15% say they receive that support. So there's very, very little training. I'm doing a project now with the US Congress, again, that's been funded to teach members of Congress how to engage with citizens, because right now that does not exist at all. Zero. Another challenge is the fact that it's very difficult to get people to participate. We tend to have these citizen engagement efforts like Decide here in Madrid that say, hello, is there anyone out there who has a good idea and wants to participate? Most people don't know. Most people don't care. Most people don't believe that it will actually work. So there are real challenges to the marketing side of citizen engagement that we need to talk about. There are real issues we have to talk about with regard to trust and surveillance and privacy, the concerns that people have. This gets back to our Cambridge Analytica conversation, but that people worry about too much engagement with government, and they don't want government listening to them or necessarily using their information without their consent. We're going to have to worry about the big bad future of what happens as we introduce more artificial intelligence into all of these processes. It's great that we have great machine learning and algorithms that let us do things like have machines that look at photos and spot cancer. That's wonderful. But we then worry about exactly the same algorithms that look at photos and predict who's gay, who look at photos or will look at tweets or will look at information and make judgments about us. And lest you think that's science fiction, this is what's going on in China right now. So we have to worry about the same technologies and how they might be used not only to engage us and treat us as active participants in our democracy, but how they might actually be used to do exactly the opposite. So last but not least, we have to do more if we're to advance this future to actually try to figure out what works, since we don't know well yet. The Decide platform here in Madrid has 400,000 people signed up for it to participate in giving ideas to the city council. And yet, up till now, only 2 ideas have ever moved forward and none have actually been enacted. So we're doing something wrong and we actually have to figure out why it's wrong. So that's why we're starting this GovLab Madrid initiative to bring some research to the process of actually identifying how could we do a better job. We're not going to figure it out simply through theory. We have to actually try things and try them again. And the great part is 70 cities are using the Consul framework, the same framework on which Decide is based, which creates an opportunity to do experiments to actually test how it is we can get people to engage, how we can get them to engage well, what will actually get government to listen to people, how we can actually use that information in ways that are actually effective. So we need more research. Research of the kind that is not simply theoretical research, pure basic research, and not simply a research that's about just solving a problem, but this exciting opportunity we have now in between, which is to both advance our understanding of the social science, of human engagement and incentives and participation, and at the same time to try to solve our urban challenges, be it less traffic or better climate or better health. This is the chance that we have. So let me end by saying that the key thing we need to do is to trust that people are smart, that expertise is widely distributed, to design the platforms that will actually achieve our desired goal. That is to say, whether it's to spot the problem, develop the solution, evaluate what we've done, and then rinse and repeat until we arrive at a vision for democracy that actually allows us to enhance both the legitimacy of our decisions, but also, and importantly, the effectiveness of those decisions. I will end with this link, which is to say, if you've liked any of the ideas here or the thought of using collective intelligence to improve how we govern, I will put the pitch to you to sign on to the Crowd Law Manifesto, a series of 12 principles that were collaboratively developed by global experts, including leaders here in Madrid, to say we need to do a better job. As government institutions, we have to do better to engage with people and their collective intelligence. As universities, we have to do the research to understand what works. As technology companies and technologists and designers, we have to design new platforms. And finally, as individuals, we have to be willing to commit to participate and to believe that this is actually the future, which is that of a collaborative, vision for democracy, an active version of citizenship, and I hope a stronger future in which collective intelligence leads not only, again, to a nice-to-have, legitimacy-building concept of participation, but the notion that collective intelligence is actually the more effective way to work and the more effective way to solve our problems. Thank you. So now comes the criticism, right? Thank you. Oh, and thank you.
Yes, I think you'll need that.
Okay.
So thank you very much, Beth, for this very...
Thank you.
Y gracias a todos ustedes también. Vamos a antes de pasar a las...
And thank you to all of you.
Vale. Y de pasar a las preguntas.
Before giving the floor to the audience, because as I was saying before, you can send them, the people that are watching this through streaming, you can send your questions directly to my mobile phone. But in order to comment on or develop further on some of the aspects, I would like you to develop further on more conceptual issues. There is a generalized concern on where our democracies are heading to, and well, the data that you have given speak by themselves. Only 30% of the Spaniards trust their government and how they are ruled, and this happens in many other countries of the world. But still, of course, what is the model we are referring to? Democracy as we know it, as it has been conceived for a long time, is representative democracy. There is a very clear function of representation through a big participation event, which is elections, where using different models, afterwards there is an executive power that takes decisions or makes decisions on public services that affect us all. Another model, which is a very different one, and that has got very influential during the crisis here in Spain, the 15th of March, the famous 15M. This is not a democracy. We are told that this is a democracy, but it doesn't seem to be. There was a lot of uneasiness and with democracy, and they were advocating for a more participative and more direct democracy. There are two ways to see this: insisting on participation, and another one would be to improve our representation, and another one could be a combination of factors. What would you call a consultative or deliberative democracy, which mixes both models? Because do you conceptually see that it would be possible to, or feasible to go to the direct participation or direct democracy, or the executive power should always be in the hands of representation?
Absolutely right. Let me start by saying that it's absolutely crucial to have a vision for what is the democracy that we want. Partly through doing some of this work, we're learning what's possible, and we're learning to develop that vision. But there clearly is a real disconnect between some of these different visions of what we want. So on the one of these last slides, I put up AI democracy. So this is an idea, just to give you an idea of what we don't want. So this is an idea that an American, actually a Chilean-American academic has been advocating to say, in the world of the future, in which there's so much data collected about me from my shopping online and my habits online, he says, or he used to say, that AI will know so much about me, more about me than I know about myself, that I don't have to participate anymore. Mm-hmm. That in fact my AI agent, my robot, will participate on my behalf. It can vote for me, it can make decisions for me, we can have direct democracy, but we never have to get off the sofa because our AI agent will do it for us. Now, we can debate, but I don't think we would have a very long debate about whether we think this is a good idea. And in fact, the person who advocated it has stopped advocating this idea, because I think we all recognize that the future we would like to achieve is one in which we're more engaged, more active, in which we have more of a role to play. And the question is how we get there. Does that change our vision of representative democracy that we've gotten very used to, where frankly we get to sit back and let someone else do it for us? Absolutely. So do I mean to be radical in the suggestion that we want to move away from this model? Absolutely. It's not a new idea. If you go back to ancient Athens, and there's some wonderful work by a philosopher and political scientist by the name of Josh Ober, who writes about why was Athens so successful. Why was Athens, now it's a much smaller scale than today, but his theory is that Athens was so successful because all of its political institutions engaged citizens. The military was run by citizens, the courts were run by citizens, the legislature was run by citizens, and it wasn't though a model in which every town got to pick their citizens because the Athenians were worried, that people would only vote to support their village or their town or their community and would be very self-interested. So they very intentionally created mixes of people across communities and had diverse groups of citizens who would meet to take decisions and then would rotate those citizens every year with everybody having a role to play. And the success of Athens, he would put to you, and there's some other work by political economist Darren Acemoglu, which says the political institutions throughout history that have been most successful, societies that have been most advanced and most economically successful, have been those in which people have engaged the most. So I think that the question is, what does that mean today, given that we have the technology to go beyond a world in which we vote and then let someone else do the rest, especially given that the people we elect don't have all the expertise that they need to solve problems. So we can send somebody to Parliament or to the City Council, but that's no reason why they can't have a conversation with us about what the problems are, what the solutions are, and that's what we're seeing in many places is at least a step towards introducing more participation into a representative model. Let me just briefly finish because I didn't fully answer the question. Is the place we want to get to fully direct democracy, where everybody is voting on everything? I would say this is a terrible idea, at least insofar as what we mean is everybody, sort of all referendum all the time. We saw with Brexit the challenge of what happens when you ask people to vote on a simplistic idea without any knowledge of the facts or the details or the evidence about how something will be implemented. So should we have people participating about things that they care about things that they know about where places in which people want to spend time and get engaged? Absolutely. And that's a future that we haven't yet invented, that blends some of the best of representative ideas with some of the best of direct ideas, taking advantage of technology to allow us to do something that I would call collaborative democracy. What that fully looks like is a future we're now beginning to invent.
Muy bien, o sea, combinación de las dos, intentar mejorar la representación con participación. Podríamos
well, we agree, but my next question would be, what do we do in those cases where the interest to participate is almost zero? There are many decisions that seem to be boring to us. They do not affect us directly, so therefore you are not interested in participating. Or when the interest is low, it's a boring topic. For example, some budgets from the government, nobody is going to read the budgets from beginning to end, because there will be many technical things that won't be interesting to practically anybody, and when they are doing this on a free willing basis or on a voluntary basis, of course, you have to think that they are devoting their time, their extra time to this. And how could we solve the problem of pluralism of interests of those participating in a representative scheme? This is solved by elections and with pluralism mechanisms like a parliament. And this is quite an invented model already. So how do we do this? How can we ensure plurality, diversity and representativity in this system?
There is an NGO called MKSS, and what they do is go from village to village and they read the budget to people. They read the budget to people in the town square like this, and they ask people to spot problems in the budget. But bridges that are claimed to have been built and were never built, people on the payroll who are actually dead. So to say that people aren't interested in or can't participate in reading budgets has to do with the fact that we make it too complicated. If I put as the value that I want citizens to engage, then maybe I'll change how I write the law so that people can actually understand it. The fact that a legal draft, I'll tell you a funny story. I got involved in doing some of our early work with Madrid when when a politician here asked us if we would review a draft of a bill for citizen engagement from Madrid. And I said I'd be happy to do that, and he sent me the draft, and it was 50 pages single-spaced. I said, well, in the first place, if you're going to have a law about citizen engagement, maybe citizens should actually be able to read it. So the fact that we make government so complicated, and by the way, I'm trained as a lawyer, so we're to blame, right? There's too many lawyers in the process. We've made it so goddamn complicated that it's really difficult. Sorry, earring. I'm sorry. I'm not supposed to move my head, I was told. So apologies for the noise. That we make it unnecessarily complicated when what we need to do is to make it simpler as a way to engage people, number one. Number two, does everybody have to participate on every topic? No, I think that's exactly the wrong idea, because you may care about education and I care about health. You care about the environment, and the next person cares about unemployment. We need to create lots of ways to participate about different topics. Some people really want to read long drafts of legislation and comment on it. And other people really just want to volunteer and go to their child's school and help out, or go to the park and clean up. We need to create different ways to engage. There's no reason to have one-size-fits-all forms of engagement. So what I like about many of these examples of what we're seeing around the world is that they offer opportunities for people to do different things that suit their interests and suit their abilities. And that actually leads to people participating well and participating effectively. So it's not the fault of individuals, it's actually the fault of the process.
Yo estoy completamente de acuerdo, y de hecho el Ayuntamiento de Madrid tiene una iniciativa.
Yes, I agree fully, and in fact the City Council of Madrid has an initiative dealing with clear language used when making decisions, so that they can be understood by citizens, because it is true, it's sometimes very difficult to understand the even sanctions, fines sometimes are really difficult to understand. And we speak about transparency, but not too much about how to make this transparency real or how to make it effective. I agree with you when you speak about participation. Look at the examples that you're setting, like education, health, climate change, etc. And this is clear that we are all interested on these topics, but not at the same level, not all of them. But many of these proposals are capital amortizations, assets, liabilities, things like this. And when I was talking about boring things, well, I speak about things that are necessary and which need to be made a decision upon. But it does not mean that they are not important, that there is no direct representation, but or representative democracy. This is not the case of parks or health or education, because of course citizens are really affected or impacted by this, and an interest is raised in this level, in these cases. But many of the decisions that are made do not have anything to do with this, and they are part of ruling a country, and It is more important to ensure their plurality, and this is where I'm more concerned. I was referring to these cases, more boring or difficult to understand cases. Anyway, we are going to open the debate with audience, because otherwise I would not stop. And I have many questions, of course, but I would not like to hinder the audience from expressing themselves precisely. Hello.
For this opportunity and for the great conference and all the insights. I would like to ask the question, based upon your experience, do you notice any differences, because you're talking about tech and about very evolved tech, a lot of future trends. Do you notice any differences in the implication and in the involvement, engagement of younger targets, older targets, when you talk about all these topics? Because all this engagement, I don't know, how, based upon your experience, what can you explain us?
Do you want to, should I answer, or you want to take more?
Si hay alguna otra pregunta, no, you can answer that. Okay.
I can hear myself talk. So it's a really interesting question, and there's been some research done on who participates on some of these platforms. So there's a Finnish scholar by the name of Tanja Ajamurto who's done work on looking at what is the gender and demographics and age of people who tend to participate. Helene Landemore, another French scholar, has done some work in this space. I think, you know, the assumption that you would have, which is that it would all be younger people somehow, actually is very often not the case. It tends to be older people, it tends to be more professional people, as is often also the case of who participates in government already, is one of the things that I think we tend to see more of. Now that may be changing, and that's different in different places. I think the Taiwan project is very much a young people's project that grows out of the sunflower movement, which was a little bit like the 15M here, and Occupy Wall Street in the US, so around the same time, a similar kind of very sort of youth-driven activist movement. But I think the important thing is that we shouldn't see these as being platforms that are only about engaging young people. Now, there is a very real motivation, especially here in Spain, as well as in the US, where government tends to be much, much older, and there's a deep sense that young people don't have a voice and are less engaged than in other places, to say we have to do more to actually attract and engage and recruit young people to participate. And that truly is the case with some of these platforms. But the thing I worry about more even than young or old or male or female has to do with the divide around wealth. So it's really about getting those people who are at the bottom of the social pyramid to actually have the opportunity to participate in many of these processes. And this is partly the response to your comment, which is that's where some of these initiatives that are what's sometimes in English called use sortition. So in other words, I'm going to randomly pick people who reflect the population to engage, is a very important complement to those processes that are only about self-selection. Because when all the people participating are wealthy, it's really important that we then have ways of reaching out into neighborhoods and engaging with people. It's really important that when we're developing or designing a service, in New York, there's a wonderful group called Policy Lab. There was a new policy passed by this mayor in 3 years ago, to say we're going to give what is it called? Preschool education to every child in New York City. But to enroll your children is a very difficult process of filling out a lot of forms. And so what they do is they go and they watch people fill out the forms, and they talk to them about filling out the forms, and they ask them, how can we make this simpler for you or easier for you? So in other words, not in the legislative side, but in the administrative side, the process of using human-centered design is another way, in addition to sortition, as a way of simply getting more people of every class and type to engage in the process. So those are the most interesting experiments. Is there a lot of it yet? Not yet.
Claro, no, pero efectivamente es muy interesante porque si hay un sesgo.
But it is very, very interesting because if there is a bias on participation due to wealth, this is like a contradiction, but we will have to look to the top, let's say, and see that these types of experiments keep a kind of participation that equals pluralism existing in society. There's a question here.
You recommend like a mix of political representation and direct democracy for the general democratic system, but I guess is that applicable also to really transforming political movements that want to change things like drastically? Because here we have the example of the UNTM that didn't have like a clear leadership. And that decision was a conscious one, in the sense that they didn't want someone to get really powerful. And the reality is that 7 years later, the movement has no visibility. I mean, there are political parties that claim to represent the interests of the UNTM. But again, the reality is that the visibility is gone. So I guess my question is that really transforming political movements aim to change things dramatically or drastically need also a combination of leadership and direct democracy or any of those.
Is that a statement or a question? I think we agree. Are we agreeing? What I hear is agreement, but that may be that. I think you very nicely summarized. I think there is a future in which we can completely get away from the kind of representative models that we see now. There have been experiments at the local level in Sweden, for example. There have been some of the pirate parties have tried things of what is sometimes called proxy voting. So in other words, not having one representative, but the idea of saying, I'm going to have the person who votes for me on environmental issues, and this person on economic issues, and this person on social issues, but the idea that you have not one representative, but many. That's an idea that has been actually tried in practice, and it's one sort of radical idea of saying we're not going to have a single representative, but we'll have multiple. I think there's a world in which we actually get rid of the whole representative concept altogether in favor of a more collaborative problem-solving process, where we say, what's the issue we're trying to solve? We're trying to reduce the amount of gun violence. We're trying to reduce the carbon emissions. And then we have lots of these collective intelligence mechanisms using data and human engagement to allow us to, again, develop a better understanding of what the problem is, begin to identify solutions to the problem, start to implement those solutions to the problem and measure what works, in which we can replace what we have with some of these new processes. To be very clear, these processes have to both capture people's values as well as their expertise, since politics is a combination of both. I need facts and data and expertise, but it's no substitute for how people feel about an issue, which may have nothing to do with the facts, as we often see. We need structures that allow us to do both of these. So I think for the time being, what we're going to see is what you're talking about, which is a combination of leadership and vision and values with structures that allow us to get at that know-how and expertise more broadly.
Sure, but at the same time, I mean, his question was referring at these changing political actors like political parties or political leaderships. But if we are talking about governing more effectively, this means also a big change in public administrations. So, who has to lead this change? How can we change the way, public sector workers, what's their incentive to change? Is just political will, like their top chief that says, you need to change, and bears the cost of that? Because el cambio siempre tiene resistencias en todos lados, ¿no? Entonces, claro,
because change always generates resistances. It has to be done top down, and someone is going to change the way that public administration is working. Are they small programs that with time and patience are going to find or to go through a more direct participation model. Of course, I'm not talking about changing the political actor, but the administration.
So includes the so this is. I'll be brief on this because I see a number of hands.
Sure.
One is that training is extremely important. We have one here and one here at least. Training is extraordinarily important because even if there's political will, knowing how to do this is actually very hard. People aren't trained, government people who go to school for public administration aren't taught how to do any of this. You're not taught to define a problem so that you can then ask people to help you to solve it. That's a skill, to know how do I articulate a problem in a way that can engage people in helping me come up with solutions. There is a learned skill to do that. Why should people learn it? Well, they're going to learn it in part because they have to learn it. They're going to learn it in part because we say, as the Germans are about to do now, is to say we need radical retraining of our civil service. Because boy, if a bureaucracy ever needed it, they invented bureaucracy in Germany. They need to retrain how they think about what they do. You need to have leadership from the top, which says you have to work differently. And above all, you have to have the political pressure, which is to say, I mean, people don't trust government. So people are going to be out of a job very quickly if we don't get our act together to do a better job at doing things. And that's going to mean working in new ways. And that is a fundamental mindset shift. Last point on this, which is the introduction of also new kinds of innovation activities in governments in different places. So it's creating an innovation lab, creating a chief innovation officer, creating an innovation training program, again, that's focused on changing people's mindset and also their skill set. And what it comes down to is exactly as you say, it's working differently than we've done before, nothing else than that.
Okay. Vamos a agrupar preguntas. Hay dos en este lado del auditorio.
There are two questions here at this side of the auditorium and then three more.
Whether there's a danger in what you're proposing that this is a technocratic solution to a question of political power. The crisis that the world has faced since 2008, the lack of confidence after the Iraq War, for example, the options that were taken over the Brexit vote in Britain, these were people with clear political interests for achieving this. It was not a problem of the citizens not coming up with enough solutions about how to deal with Iraq. I have a slight fear that we're moving to a solution that would have worked well in the Clinton and Blair days when we had consensus. And in such a polarized society as we have now, what you're really talking about is a major shift in values that needs to occur. And when you come up with solutions, you have to come up with solutions that are very large. I doubt very much the National Health Service was created in Britain out of citizens groups getting together to discuss what they'd like. I just feel there's a slight lack of political and power politics in the exposé.
Sí, el señor de atrás, espera que estaba en... We group by three,
Hola.
okay?
It is clear that the world is not going well and that the future is really of some concern, is worrying. Changes are necessary, but the faster way to achieve changes is when you take power, when you have access to power. And the political establishment in the world has polling engineer for things so that things will not change. Things will be kept unmoved, unchanged, and you don't see any proportionality in Spain. In many other countries it's the same. It is easier to be a parliamentary or member of parliament in a community where traditional political parties have circumscription, or let's say more electoral clientele, let's say, than in any other new sector. And these politicians that want to change something find a lot of obstacles to get to power because there is no proportionality that may help them. Don't you think that reform where proportionality will be respected and these leaderships, emerging leaders can access to power without so many difficulties imposed by dominant parties with this electoral engineer would be better? Don't you think so? I'm going to read the question that has come through the streaming.
Democracy in which the participation and the vote of all is requested between collective intelligence and collective anger, right? Has a lot to do with what he was asking. And we group questions, is that okay, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So last question to group.
Hello, Beth. Thank you. So my question actually may be related to what I've just heard. And it would be about what's your opinion about something that myself, I don't actually have an opinion yet. And I think you guys were agreeing before about that not everyone has to decide or vote about everything. And that I think we all might be agreeing on that. But what about, should everyone be voting about things in terms of like participation? Because so it's clear that depending on your background, your education, and your age, even your experience, your capabilities, you're not going to know as much, and maybe your decision is not going to be as worth it, honestly. That's my point of view sometimes. But on the other hand, democracy definitely is about everyone, but like everyone has to be represented, and I think that's the intention of representation. But does everyone know what is good for them?
So this is about philosophy now. Cerraríamos este turno porque si no, no podrá realmente.
We're going to close this round of questions because otherwise, right, there are many different questions, so we need to go back to Beth.
Better.
Well, first of all, happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you.
So it's yet another angle to the questions that they were just made. I think it's not just the technocratic aspect of representative democracy that is not working. I'm especially interested in local government, and as you know, electoral participation rate in the US on average in local elections is 20%. So it's not just that whether everyone should vote or not, it's that just 20% are voting, and also that 20% is biased in terms of wealth, race, etc. So my question is, and there are also power dynamics and institutional design elements that are determining that lower participation rate. So the very specific question is, what can we do with technology to also make the representative democracy, in particular elections, work best?
So, first group, we have second group, third group. So, yes, people wait late. I mean, we are late hours, as we were saying before. So
okay, let me give very brief. I won't call them answers. I will give very brief hints at further topics for discussion, because these are very sophisticated and important questions. Let me start with what I think in many ways is the hardest, the question about politics and about power. And this idea that at some sense, well, this is all kind of nice. Participatory budgeting is sort of sweet, people deciding about playgrounds and football pitches, but this is not where the real power politics is at. Number one is part of your point. Trump is a bigger phenomenon than playgrounds. Number one, and number two, that innovation and creativity is not always done by committee. So the big ideas are not something that can be done necessarily through sort of push button voting mechanisms. So I think there are two concepts that are involved, that are rolled up in this. Let me take the second one first, which is easier, which is to say that again, it depends on what the questions are that we ask. Right now, most of these participation mechanisms are frankly a little bit frivolous and silly. They're so limited in what they ask people to do, partly because people worry about the question this young woman asked, which is that they don't have a lot of faith or trust in what people actually know. The counterexample is something like challenge.gov, which was started in the United States and has not been copied quite so successfully anywhere else, which is a platform to pose very hard questions to people and to solicit their answers. And there have been 750 challenges on that platform, looking for solutions to things like, how do I take the salt out of salt water to improve agriculture? How do I increase the number of words that a poor child hears before they're 5 compared to a rich child? How do I design the next generation of space vehicle? So these are not silly questions, if we want to put it that way. They're really hard questions. Do they attract thousands of people to participate? No. But we don't need thousands of people. We need a few people who have really good inspirational ideas for how to solve hard problems. And for this, we've taken a page from what industry has done in what we might call open innovation, to ask people to come up with solutions to hard problems. So I don't think the limitation to this kind of frivolous stuff is an artificial barrier that we've put up for ourselves. How does it change the fundamental kind of calculus around power politics? Let me say, we do have to be worried, until we reinvent this great future, we have to be very worried about elections, and we have to be worried about who gets elected, which is why it's great that we saw greater citizen engagement and turnout in the most recent election in the United States 2 weeks ago than we've ever seen before in a sort of non-presidential election year. Rates of participation are through the roof. Might be one of the greatest benefits, if there are any, to the Trump presidency, is that he's gotten so many people so angry that they're participating for a change and becoming more active and engaged citizens. So we do have to worry especially about those people who are not interested in the process, who are actually dangerous, who are truly dangerous for the process. This is a significant challenge. Do these things help with that? I would like to think that they do. Number one, because the way that we govern today cannot get any worse. We have to do something different than we do. So it's the fact that it may not be perfect is not a reason not to do it. The fact that people may not participate as well as we might like them to in every process is not a reason not to do it, because it really can't get worse than the way, in many ways, that we do some of these things today. And that the more that we develop the practice and the expectation that people will have a role to play, and that it's incumbent upon our political officials, on our civil servants to actually engage with people. Once we create that expectation, I would like to think, and I've been wrong on many times before. My child tells me I'm wrong at least 10 times before breakfast. So it's not impossible that we still will have demagogues and dictators we have to fight, but that we create the expectation for people to engage, and we hopefully can grow that expectation into something that becomes truly a politically powerful phenomenon. Do we have to worry about people's, again, the issue of apathy and participation and low rates of engagement? Again, it's about creating ways in which more people can and want to participate. Should I participate in voting? There's a lot of debate mathematically about whether it actually makes a difference. And in a reality of money and politics and lobbyists, it's not clear that it actually does make all that much difference, any one individual vote, which is why it's so important to create these mechanisms. Do we think that everybody is wise and civic and has a great knowledge of the political process? No, but they don't need to have it. That's part of the problem, is we assume that citizen engagement and collective intelligence means I have to know something about politics. I don't. I need to know something about diabetes if I suffer from this disease, or I need to know something about bridge building if I'm an engineer, or I need to know something about education if I'm a school teacher, and that might allow me to participate in ways that actually are meaningful and allow me to participate to the best of my ability, because it speaks to either what I know or what I care deeply about enough to spend the time doing. Do we need to have ways to participate that are simple and easy for some people, to suggest an idea or spot a problem? Sure. To be able to tweet, there's a pothole in the street or a red light that's out? Sure. Will some people only want to do that and other people want to spend more time developing the solutions, of course. It's not going to be everybody who does all these things, and I think in part that gets to the issue of how do we bring out everybody's best nature, or at least the better nature that so many of us want to demonstrate. Are people participating? Well, yes. 200,000 people in Taiwan who are doing this, 20% of the population in Reykjavik, all the people who participated in Estonia, 650,000 people signed up in Brazil. People want to engage, and we're missing that opportunity to try to leverage their collective intelligence. And now I think I forgot all the other questions.
But Madrid decide, not so much of a success in terms of engaging.
I think
number of people, I mean. But no, I have to shut up because there are a lot of questions here. So os pido por favor, es que...
We have some more questions here, but we have to finish in 2 minutes. So I know it's impossible, but...
Basically, what we're talking about, you mentioned it at the beginning of your talk, we have to find a way to foster trust and faith in the system again, right? I would say that's the basic key to rolling out other ways of governing. What is the real roadmap toward that? That's a very difficult thing to do. The way things are polarized in this country, in our country as well, what is the path? Yeah, what is the path to regaining that trust? That people will allow other people to decide for them, or for them to want to participate themselves.
¿Quién más había pedido la palabra ahí?
Anybody else back there? Yes, maybe I would like, and it's related to what you were saying, I would like you to say what we can do for improving the quality of our leaders, because I think that's inherent to everything that we've been talking about, that it has to do with what we're living in Spain and everywhere else, to improve their expertise, their intentions, just like that in general, right? And one more. And then we close with this. Well, in my case, I think that most problems can be solved generally with public callings. For example, if there's a problem with cancer and there's a public policy, you have a public calling to develop a series of projects, and then you tackle the problem. So this culture generally in underdeveloped countries, we don't have it. This participative models, it's starting to emerge, and I would like to know if you know about any project anywhere in the world that is going along those lines to improve participation of the citizens in the government and public policies.
Yes.
Last question, please.
It was great. I'm working on an idea for an app that is basically directly related to this, so this was sugar to my ears. The question would be, well, we are in a world where technology goes so quickly that the law is not quick enough to catch up, and here the companies have a main role. For me, it has been the elephant in the room that we have been missing. The companies have so much power in making laws and the money that they want to make. So how should we in the future society divide the responsibilities between people, the representatives of people, and the companies? If company, like the responsibility of companies should exist or not, and within this framework applied to media, how should people choices, if they are influenced by media who are actually companies that are showing news based on what's better for the interest of the money, basically, how should we get out of that problem? Yeah, because if we say yes, opinion should matter, but opinion is based on what media is telling you to think. So how to get away from all that? Sorry for being too long.
So, but that's it. You know what my kid tells me? Mom, you're so super 20th century, you know. He doesn't even get angry with me. He just despises me like 20th century woman that does not understand anything. So these are old problems, at the same time 20th century problems, many of them, but you have 3 minutes to try to answer to them. Leadership, money, influence.
My goodness.
Values.
Well, obviously, I apologize in advance for the poor answers. So there were a number of questions, and it was the question I didn't get to before, which requires a longer discussion about fundamental sort of structural changes, and it depends on the system. For example, to remove and potentially weaken in many places the overbearing influence of political parties, a challenge that we also see in the United States that very often gets in the way of more innovative, more direct forms of engagement by individuals. There are issues about money in politics where the regulation of, we've seen going backward in the United States with regard to allowing companies to have an unbordered, unbridled influence on the political process through money. We've seen the challenges, obviously, of fake news and the challenges, frankly, that come from companies whose business model is to sell advertising, and knowing that what drives advertising is more people watching the content, and what gets more people to watch the content is to make it negative or to make it fact-free, to play fast and loose with the truth, where there's some of these issues that are going to be solved through a combination of new kinds of technology, but also, frankly, regulation, where we're just going to have to step in and say that if Facebook is now the public sphere and this is where most dialogue is happening, then we have a responsibility to be concerned, particularly about the spread of false rumors that leads very seriously to people getting killed in places in the world where rumors spread quickly on WhatsApp, on Facebook, etc. So where it's not enough to say that a private sector technology solution is it, although what we need are also then alternative platforms and solutions that take the public interest to heart and that are really designed to motivate good forms and civic forms of engagement and of participation. So I think we're going to see a combination of technological solutions, but it would be naive to assume that we can do the technology without also having the legal changes that we need to actually ensure that we're both institutionalizing these forms of participation, and that's one exciting thing that's happened here, at least in part, to create some small legal framework in Madrid for engagement and participation, and to say we're going to make that the law, as well as then to develop the platforms and practices that actually allow people to do this work. So I'm conscious of the late hour and of the poor job that I've done in responding to what is an incredible series of really, really fundamental, hard, deeply philosophical, legal, political, technological challenges. We're going to need all of these tools in our toolkit. But the thing I would say is that despite all of these hard questions, they shouldn't get in the way of actually just starting to do it. And that's where, to this point, and I hope some of these were illustrations, there are 100 examples. They're up there online. I've put them up online for you. There are 100 cases of people actually trying things. Not all of it works. Some of it teaches us exactly what we should not do and what we should not try. But there is some effort, at least, and momentum by people both on the institutional side and on the civil society side, in many cases from companies as well, from universities, who are saying it's enough. We can't continue with the model that we have now. We need to think differently about how we run campaigns. We need to think differently about how we do politics. And above all, we need to think differently about what we do the day after the election, when we actually have to govern and solve really hard problems. And that's the first place we need to start, with engaging with people's collective intelligence, taking advantage of these new tools, experimenting, studying what works, trying different things until we actually achieve some better understanding of what are the ways in which we can actually then solve the really hard problems. We will continue to have value debates about what are the right solutions. Even we will have value debates about whether something is a problem or not. But once we identify a problem, whether we agree or not, and we say this thing is supposed to solve it and make it better, that should actually be the case. And so that comes down to the very simple change, such a mundane thing. I've said it already and I'm going to say it one last time at the end, that the very simple act of learning to articulate and define a problem and put some data back of it would be the very first step in then actually getting people's help with solving it. That's the thing we have to demand of our politicians if we want to get better leadership. Is not to demand of people that they have the answers for us, but that they have the problems and that they're willing to ask us to help solve them. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Yo me voy a casa con este lema, ¿eh?
I go home with this motto: let's stop preaching and let's stop working and putting our hands to work. This is my lesson, the lesson that I take home, and I think it would be a good idea that you also take this lesson home. Thank you very much and for your attention. Thank you for coming. Bye bye.